Number 1.
At shortly after 9:30 p.m. on Friday, 3 December 1926, Agatha Christie got up from her armchair and climbed the stairs of her Berkshire home. She kissed her sleeping daughter Rosalind, aged 7, good night, and made her way back downstairs again. Then she climbed into her Morris Cowley and drove off into the night. She would not be seen again for 11 days. Her disappearance would spark one of the largest manhunts ever mounted. Agatha Christie was already a famous writer, and more than 1,000 policemen were assigned to the case, along with hundreds of civilians. For the first time, aeroplanes were also involved in the search. The Home Secretary, William Joynson Hicks, urged the police to make faster progress in finding her. Two of Britain's most famous crime writers, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, and Dorothy L. Sayers, author of the Lord Peter Wimsey series, were drawn into the search. Their specialist knowledge, it was hoped, would help find the missing writer. It didn't take long for the police to locate her car. It was found abandoned on a steep slope at Newlands Corner near Guildford. But there was no sign of Agatha Christie herself, and nor was there any evidence that she'd been involved in an accident. As the first day of investigations progressed into the second and third, and there was still no sign of her, speculation began to mount. The press had a field day, inventing ever more lurid theories as to what might have happened. It was the perfect tabloid story, with all the elements of an Agatha Christie whodunit. Close to the scene of the car accident was a natural spring known as the Silent Pool, where two young children were reputed to have died. Some journalists ventured to suggest that the novelist had deliberately drowned herself. Yet her body was nowhere to be found, and suicide seemed unlikely, for her professional life had never looked so optimistic. Her sixth novel, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, was selling well, and she was already a household name. Some said the incident was nothing more than a publicity stunt, a clever ruse to promote her new book. Others hinted at a far more sinister turn of events. There were rumors that she'd been murdered by her husband, Archie Christie, a former First World War pilot and serial philanderer. He was known to have a mistress. Arthur Conan Doyle, a keen occultist, tried using paranormal powers to solve the mystery. He took one of Christie's gloves to a celebrated medium in the hope that it would provide answers. It did not. Dorothy Sayers visited the scene of the writer's disappearance to search for possible clues. This proved no less futile. By the second week of the search, the news had spread around the world. It even made the front page of the New York Times. How long was Agatha Christie missing for, and what happened? Not until 14 December, fully 11 days after she disappeared, was Agatha Christie finally located. She was found safe and well in a hotel in Harrogate, but in circumstances so strange that they raised more questions than they solved. Christie herself was unable to provide any clues to what had happened. She remembered nothing. It was left to the police to piece together what might have taken place. They came to the conclusion that Agatha Christie had left home and traveled to London, crashing her car en route. She had then boarded a train to Harrogate. On arriving at the spa town, she checked into the Swan Hydro, now the Old Swan Hotel, with almost no luggage. Bizarrely, she used the assumed name of Teresa Neal, her husband's mistress. Harrogate was the height of elegance in the 1920s, and filled with fashionable young things. Agatha Christie did nothing to arouse suspicions as she joined in with the balls, dances, and palm court entertainment. She was eventually recognized by one of the hotel's banjo players, Bob Tappan, who alerted the police. They tipped off her husband, Colonel Christie, who came to collect Agatha immediately. But his wife was in no hurry to leave. Indeed, she kept him waiting in the hotel lounge while she changed into her evening dress. Agatha Christie never spoke about the missing 11 days of her life, and over the years there has been much speculation about what really happened between 3 and 14 December 1926. Her husband said that she'd suffered a total memory loss as a result of the car crash. But according to biographer Andrew Norman, the novelist may well have been in what's known as a fugue state, or, more technically, a psychogenic trance. It's a rare condition brought on by trauma or depression. Norman says that her adoption of a new personality, Teresa Neal, and her failure to recognize herself in newspaper photographs were signs that she had fallen into psychogenic amnesia. I believe she was suicidal, says Norman. Her state of mind was very low, and she writes about it later through the character of Celia in her autobiographical novel Unfinished Portrait. She soon made a full recovery, and once again picked up her writer's pen. But she was no longer prepared to tolerate her husband's philandering. She divorced him in 1928, and later married the distinguished archaeologist Sir Max Mallowan. We'll probably never know for certain what happened in those lost 11 days. Agatha Christie left a mystery that even Hercule Poirot would have been unable to solve.
Number 2.
Meet Barbara. Not exactly your average American kid. Barbara is extremely gifted. She is intelligent and ambitious. A prodigy, very much in awe of nature and in love with writing. In 1927, at the incredibly young age of 12, Barbara published her first novel to great critical acclaim. 2 years later, her second novel followed. Then things changed. In spite of her literary success, she suffered several personal blows and reportedly became depressed. In December 1939, at the age of 25, Barbara walked out of her Brookline apartment, never to be seen again. Like so many of us, I enjoy a great mystery tremendously, and although Barbara's life story reads as if Agatha Christie and Daphne du Maurier brainstormed to dream up a fantastic new character and write a compelling tale of success, lost ideals and broken dreams, Barbara was real. I write was, but to this day nobody is certain of what happened to the author, and if she perhaps fled to start a brand new life, is still alive and over 100 years old. The idea of escape is a powerful one. I think all of us have at one time or another, even for the briefest of moments, considered running off and starting our lives over. A clean slate. Doing it all again, but better. If only we could. The element of escape is what makes disappearances not only tragic but also exciting, even if we don't want to admit it. There are famous cases of authors who, in their own particular way, disappeared. Agatha Christie staged her own escape, only to be found by her husband in a health spa 2 weeks later. Virginia Woolf escaped in the most tragic and definitive way by walking into the river and taking her own life. But back to Barbara Newell Follet. The daughter of critic and editor Wilson Follet and children's writer Helen Thomas Follet, she was homeschooled and probably encouraged by her parents to write from an early age on. Especially Wilson, her father, had a particular influence on her ambitions as an author. One thing is certain. Barbara had a vivid imagination, and those who lived with were required to take her fantasies very seriously. "Don't go sit there, Daddy," Barbara would say when her father took a seat at the dinner table. "That's where Beethoven sits." Barbara invented her own language. Ferksoo. She was in awe of words and books, but perhaps even more so of nature. Her debut novel, The House Without Windows, the title being a metaphor to nature itself, is an incredibly sensitive ode to the beauty and inspiration of the meadows, the sea, and the mountains. Barbara lived in a village and loved to play in the woods and on the river, and to run off to hide between the trees, where she'd act out her stories. Encouraged and guided by her father, she wrote most of her debut novel when she was 9. Unfortunately, the manuscript was destroyed in a domestic fire. Barbara rewrote it, and 3 years the novel was published with Knopf. The debut received much critical acclaim, but Barbara especially reveled in the pride her father took in her accomplishments. Later that year, Barbara left on a 10-day excursion aboard a schooner to Nova Scotia, and when she returned she had finished her second novel. Part fiction, part travel memoir of her time at sea. The Voyage of the Normandy was published immediately and, again, received critical praise. However, that same year life took a turn for the worse. Barbara's father left her mother for another woman. Barbara was shattered and heartbroken. In long letters she begged her dear daddy dog to come back. He didn't. At the age of 16, Barbara moved to a small New York apartment with her mother. They didn't receive any money from Barbara's father, and the Great Depression made circumstances even more difficult. Barbara found a job as a secretary. She had little to no contact with her father, and though she kept on writing, she wasn't able to get her subsequent manuscripts published. This rejection caused her to ponder the painful question, can I do it without him? In the summer of 1931, Barbara fell in love with Nickerson Rogers, an outdoorsman who shared her deep love for nature and eventually married him. After a few happy years in which they backpacked through Europe, Barbara started to suspect that her Nick might be cheating on her. She became depressed, stopped writing, withdrew from contact with family and friends. Then, on a cold December day, reportedly after a fight with her husband, she left their apartment and vanished without a trace. Today, Barbara's mysterious disappearance is still surrounded by questions. Why would a promising writer suddenly walk out on her life and never return? If she willingly ran away, why did she take nothing but $30 and a notebook with her? And why did her husband Nick wait for 2 weeks until he called the police? Here's another. When Nick requested a missing persons bulletin 4 months after her disappearance, why did he list it under Barbara's married name Rogers, causing the author's disappearance to go by unnoticed by the media? It wasn't until 2 decades later, in 1966, the press picked up on the story of the lost American prodigy. Fascinated by Barbara, I've tried to bring some of her back to life in my debut novel. To this day, I'm continuing my research into her mysterious case, looking into files on her disappearance, and assembling all the documents that still exist in an effort to get to the bottom of this captivating mystery. Did the betrayal by the 2 most important men in her life bring Barbara Newhall Follet down? Did a violent accident occur in the apartment on that tragic evening? Or was it her own doing, and did Barbara finally act on a dream she had all along, which she described in her debut novel Through the Eyes of Epersup, a young girl who runs away from her family to live in the wild? If she's alive, Barbara would be 104. She could have built that beautiful house deep in the woods she dreamed of. However, I believe she isn't, and she didn't. For her sake, I'll keep digging. And I do hope one day I'll be able to tell you what truly happened to Barbara on that mysterious December night.
Number 3.
Happy 179th birthday, Ambrose Bierce, prolific short story writer, roving journalist, feared critic, biting satirist, Civil War veteran, sometime poet, weird fiction pioneer, and surely the most famous missing person in American literary history. Now, and with apologies to the scholars, superfans, and completists amongst you, chances are the only Bierce you've read is his much anthologized 1890 short story An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. The tale, about a man being prepared for execution by hanging from an Alabama railroad bridge during the American Civil War, is famous in American letters for being an early example of stream of consciousness narration and non-linear story structure, as well as for its gut punch of a twist ending. Kurt Vonnegut called it the greatest American short story of all time. I consider anybody a twerp who hasn't read the greatest American short story, which is An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce. It is a flawless example of American genius, like Sophisticated Lady by Duke Ellington or The Franklin Stove. David Lynch, Tobias Wolff, David Benioff, Charlie Booker, and Terry Gilliam have all paid homage to it in their work. It's even referenced in a Bon Jovi video. Reading AOAOCB now, 130 years on from its initial publication, it's still a marvelously unsettling story, but no more unsettling, I would argue, than the mysterious nature of its author's disappearance. In October 1913, a 71-year-old Bierce, by then considered to be one of the country's most influential journalists, embarked on a tour of his old Civil War battlefields before making his way south and crossing into Mexico, which was 3 years into a decade-long revolution at the time, where he joined Pancho Villa's army as an observer. He witnessed the Battle of Tierra Blanca before accompanying Villa's army as far as the city of Chihuahua. So far, so journalistic. Then he vanished without a trace, never to be seen or heard from again. Spooky, right? So what happened to Ambrose? Well, to this day nobody knows for sure, but there are some interesting theories out there. Theory 1. He committed suicide. It had been a hard final decade or so for Bierce. Both of his sons, Day and Lee, predeceased him. Day shot himself in 1889 after being rejected by the love of his life, and Lee died of alcoholism-related pneumonia in 1901, as did his ex-wife, Molly, who divorced him in 1904 and died in 1905. Bierce also suffered from lifelong asthma and complications from a traumatic brain injury sustained in the war. At the end of all that, that he was probably quite tired. Some believe that the whole "I'm headed to Mexico to cover the war" thing was just a ruse to throw people off the scent of his true intentions, and that, in reality, Bierce wandered into the Grand Canyon to end it all on his own terms. His last known communication with the world was a letter he wrote, and supposedly mailed from Chihuahua City, to a close friend named Blanche Partington. Dated December 26, 1913, it closes with these ominous words: "As to me, I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." Theory 2. He was executed by Pancho Villa's firing squad. For many years, James Lehnert, a retired American priest serving in Mexico, doggedly pursued the theory, based on accounts he heard from elderly locals and their descendants in Sierra Majada, Coahuila, that Bierce was executed on the orders of Pancho Villa and buried in the small desert town. Lehnert even paid for a gravestone to be installed in the Sierra Majada cemetery, where he presumes Bierce's remains still lie. The gravestone reads, "Very trustworthy witnesses suppose that here lie the remains of Ambrose Bierce, 1842-1914, a famous American writer and journalist who, on suspicion of being a spy, was executed and buried at this place. 2004. If this really was the fate of poor Ambrose, at least he had been prepared for the grim eventuality." In a letter to his niece Laura, allegedly written shortly before he crossed over into Mexico, Bierce wrote, "Goodbye. If you hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think that a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs. To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia." Fair enough. Theory 3. He was killed by Mexican federal forces. An American soldier of fortune named Tex O'Reilly advanced the theory that Bierce was killed before ever even meeting Villa. O'Reilly maintained that Bierce was shot dead by Mexican federal fighters while drinking at a cantina in a mining camp called Sierra Majada. They assumed he was a spy, and since Bierce spoke no Spanish, he was unable to disabuse them of the notion before they dragged him to the cemetery, shot him, and buried him in an unmarked grave. O'Reilly wrote in his autobiography that, shortly after the shooting, he was taken to the house where the dead American had been staying, and had personally asked the owner if anything had been left behind. According to O'Reilly, the old fellow reached up behind a rafter on the wall, and brought out 2 old empty envelopes left by the Americano, and they were both addressed to Ambrose Bierce. Theory 4. He died of pneumonia on his way back to the U.S. According to this 2019 article by Chris Opfer, there's a chance that Bierce, aka Ambrosia, is buried in a different unmarked grave in Marfa, Texas. Journalist Jake Silverstein in 2002 explored the theory that Bierce bid adieu to the physical world in Texas, not Mexico. Silverstein dug up an old letter to the editor of a tiny local newspaper in Marfa, Texas, from a man who claimed Bierce's body was buried there in an unmarked grave. That man told Silverstein that he had once picked up a hitchhiker who had fought for the Mexican federal forces as a teenager. The hitchhiker told the story of picking up an old gringo who appeared quite sick and called himself Ambrosia. He paid the man and his friends to help get him back into the U.S., and during the trip he talked of the many books he had written, one with the word devil in the title. But Ambrosia didn't survive the trip back to the U.S., and instead died of pneumonia on January 17, 1914, his body buried in an unmarked grave in Marfa, Texas. It's possible that the man who called himself Ambrosia was Ambrose Bierce. Theory 5. He's still alive. The oldest person ever whose age has been independently verified is Jean Calment, 1875-1997, of France, who lived to the age of 122 years, 164 days. If Bierce is still alive out there somewhere, perhaps hibernating in a cave in the Sonoran Desert, he has beaten Jean's record by almost 57 years.
Number 4.
Connie Converse was arguably the first modern American female singer-songwriter. She was writing and recording her own music in the mid-1950s, but then she vanished without a trace in August 1974. In this blog post we discuss her life, her mysterious disappearance, and her music. Elizabeth Eaton Converse was born on August 3, 1924, in Laconia, New Hampshire. She was a highly intelligent and creative child who was later awarded a full scholarship to Mount Holyoke College. However, Elizabeth did not complete her studies. She changed her name to Connie and made her way to New York City to pursue her dream of becoming a writer and musician. She rejected her parents' traditional teetotal God-fearing upbringing for a more creative life in Greenwich Village, where the beatniks and bohemians were creating their very own counterculture in the 1950s. Converse had a political essay published and was also writing poetry, painting and drawing cartoons, taking road trips, and teaching herself to play guitar. She began writing songs and recording them at home with a Crestwood 404 tape recording machine. The American folk music scene was still dominated by traditional political songs sung mainly by men at that time. The concept of the solo acoustic female singer-songwriter was ahead of its time. Connie Converse paved the way for future artists like Joan Baez and Joni Mitchell. When Converse moved to an apartment in Harlem that had a piano, almost overnight, the style and sophistication of her music changed, and her new voice began to evolve. At this time, Converse self-recorded a tape of all her old guitar songs. This project seems to be both a retrospective and a declaration of where she wanted to head next musically. Converse was unconcerned with her physical appearance and her image. She did not sport any makeup and often wore glasses. With her long plain dresses, sensible cardigans, and tied her hair back in a bun or ponytail, she looked more like a schoolteacher than a musician. Connie was a very private and sometimes solitary person, and there is no proof of her having any serious personal or sexual relationships. It has been suggested by those who knew her best that she was probably a lesbian, although she never herself confirmed or denied the fact. Despite her ambitions to be a singer-songwriter, she did not play conventional live gigs, although she did appear live on the morning show on CBS in 1954. That same year, she recorded a set of songs in the kitchen of her friend, Gene Deitch. He had recorded Pete Seeger and John Lee Hooker back in the 1940s. Deitch and her other friends tried to help Converse's career, but it just never took off. She felt that she just couldn't quite connect with people through her music. She never got a recording contract or became that well known. In January 1961, the same year that Bob Dylan moved to Greenwich Village, frustrated by her inability to find the right audience for her songs, Converse decided to turn her back on the music scene. She left New York and got a job at the University of Michigan, where she did secretarial work and wrote for the Journal of Conflict Resolution in 1963. When the journal closed down, she lost her job and then discovered she needed to have a hysterectomy, which had a devastating effect on her mental health. She was nearing middle age, she had no job and no special person in her life, and she could no longer have children. Unfulfilled and feeling very depressed, she began drinking heavily. A holiday to London funded by her friends, and then a trip to Alaska with her mother, did very little to lift her mood. In August 1974, 1 week after she had celebrated her 50th birthday, she sent a series of letters to family and friends that spoke of her need to make a fresh start and begin a new life somewhere else. She wrote, "Let me go. Let me be if I can. Let me not be if I can't. Human society fascinates me and awes me and fills me with grief and joy. I just can't find my place to plug into it." Connie Converse packed all of her personal belongings into her Volkswagen Beetle car, drove away from her house, and was never heard from again. The mystery of what actually became of her is still unsolved to this day. Her family believe she may have taken her own life, probably by driving her car into a lake or a river somewhere, but neither her car nor her body has ever been found. Many others like to think she miraculously discovered the new life she had written about in her letters, had reinvented herself, and did not want to be found. Converse's life and songs were destined to be forgotten until Deitch's original recordings were played on a radio show. In March 2009, How Sad, How Lovely, an album containing 17 songs by Converse, was released. In 2014, a 40-minute documentary film We Lived Alone about Converse and her music was made by U.S. filmmaker Andrea Canz. Converse's life and music have served as the inspiration for a play by Howard Fishman, who also produced the album Connie's Piano Songs, featuring music written by Converse, but never recorded. Since then, the legend of Connie Converse has been slowly growing again, and many years after she first made those pioneering recordings in Greenwich Village, Connie Converse's voice can be heard once again, and her audience is finally listening and appreciating just what a groundbreaking original singer-songwriter she really was.
Number 5.
One spring evening in 1957, two Americans sat in a Mexican cantina and talked throughout the night. One, 21 years old and full of artistic aspirations, would become the columnist Pete Hamill. The other was the mustachioed, erudite and long-vanished poet Weldon Kees. That's how Hamill told it, anyway. Kees, once deeply ensconced in the American art scene, had disappeared 2 years before the alleged meeting, a mystery that has dogged the literary scene ever since. Though largely forgotten now by academia, Kees has been resurrected by poets who, over the years, have rediscovered his work. On July 19, 1955, Kees' car was found in a bank of fog by the Golden Gate Bridge, Kees in the ignition. When his mother was told he jumped off the bridge, she protested, but he was never the athletic type. Born in Nebraska in 1914, the missing poet is most certainly dead by now, no matter what happened in 1955. But what's almost more fascinating than the mystery of Kees' fate is the divide between artists and scholars over the writer's legacy on American poetry. My interest in Kees has nothing to do with his suicide, says California poet laureate Dana Gioia. I simply think his work is spectacularly powerful. Gioia says that for most scholars, Kees is a mere footnote, dismissed as a minor poet when compared with Robert Lowell or Elizabeth Bishop. The Cambridge Introduction to 20th Century American Poetry doesn't even mention Kees, and the only biography of him, Vanished Act, was written by a poet rather than an academic. But for poets themselves, including Gioia, it's another story. Gioia finds Kees' body of work staggering, modern, finely tuned to an age of media and cynicism. Kees even inspired a book of essays and poems, Aspects of Robinson, by dozens of poets who have been influenced by him. Despite his near absence from scholarly lists of important poets and not being taught in college, Kees has grabbed dozens of poets by the throat and changed their work, Gioia says. And he wasn't just a poet either. Kees was a one-man avant-garde, Gioia says. He wrote a novel in the early 1940s that remained unpublished because Knopf deemed it too unpatriotic in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He also made experimental films, was a modestly successful painter, wrote jazz ballads and scored a film. Kees was married for a while, but his alcoholic wife had a psychotic breakdown that led to their divorce, and he maintained a barbiturate habit that exacerbated his bipolar disorder. He ran in the same circles as Pauline Kael, William Carlos Williams and Lawrence Ferling Eddy, and he had a cat whom he called Lonesome. It's Kees' poetry that is the most revered of his creative work, particularly 4 poems published in The New Yorker that tell the story of a Prufrock-esque everyman named Robinson. Kees is always departing, says James Riedel, author of Vanished Act. He doesn't write a book of Robinson poems, doesn't exploit his creation. Riedel notes how Kees moving from one art to another was a struggle against the existential rigidity of committing to just one thing. Some have insinuated that he never became famous because he couldn't commit to being a poet, but the fact remains that while his paintings and films are decent, his poems powerfully chronicle a low-key apocalypse. Kees' work is so evocative that many have been tempted to seek clues to his personality in his most famous character, Robinson. And for clues to his fate? Robinson is afraid, drunk, sobbing, but he never launches himself off a bridge, runs away to Mexico, or has all-night conversations with a young Pete Hamill. So what really happened to Kees? Riedel believes he jumped, and Gioia says he's almost certain that Kees, who was obsessed with the Golden Gate, met his end there. If he'd fled to Mexico, Riedel reckons, Kees' creative drive would have led to new notoriety, rather than sipping tequila on a beach until the end of his days. It would have been impossible, Gioia says, for him to disappear quietly.